Come on. Run them tools fast. Run them tools fast. Run them tools fast. Run them tools fast. Welcome to the Week 3 edition of the Sharp Football Analysis Podcast. My name is Warren Sharp of sharpfootballanalysis.com. Guys, we got an awesome podcast in store for you today. I'm recording this right now at the conclusion of the New York Jets-Indianapolis Colts Monday night game where the Jets pulled off the upset. I don't know which podcast I like better. This one that recaps everything that we just saw, digging deeply into the advanced metrics and analytics to get a better understanding of who these teams are currently right now and what we can expect out of them, or the podcast that we recorded later in the week where I'm joined by Evan Silva and we really dive down into what's going to happen in these upcoming games. Both these podcasts are very fun to record, research, analyze, and I think hopefully you'll find that we're going to provide you with a lot of unique information and insight into some of these games that you're not going to find elsewhere. Some of the advanced metrics and analytics are really going to hopefully open your eyes to get a better understanding of how these teams are getting things done in the 2015 season. So with that said, strongly encourage you, if this is the first time checking out the podcast, go to iTunes, the Sharp Football Analysis Podcast, subscribe to it. You can also subscribe to it on YouTube because we are posting this on YouTube as well and throwing up graphics there. I will link to that specific page where you can watch the YouTube file within the iTunes podcast description. So if you're subscribing to it in iTunes on the subscription and you want to check out the graphics themselves, all you got to do is just look at the description in iTunes of this particular episode and you'll be able to link right to that. With that said, let's dive down into some of these games, and before we do that, we'll jump right into the weekly headlines because there's a lot to cover here for this week. A lot of exciting action, teams overperforming or underperforming what we expected from them based upon what we saw in week 1, and that's basically what always happens in week 2 of the NFL season. Some teams will surprise you, some teams will disappoint you, and right now we get a chance to break it down. So let's jump right now into the weekly headlines. Story number 1, the myth of winning in the offseason. Guys, we hear it every single year when free agency rolls around, when teams make trades. This team won, that team won, this other team lost, and everybody wants to go out on a limb, give everybody grades, and I can understand the need to try to grade out the different player movements and that sort of thing, but crowning a team a winner or a loser based upon certain players that they bring in that we think might fit their scheme or we hope that might replace a player who is leaving is very difficult to do in the offseason. And we see it every single year. Everybody gets very excited about this phenomenon. But this year is a perfect example of how that doesn't necessarily work and how the best teams do not do much in free agency whatsoever. They build their talent through the draft. So let me break this down. I flashed a graphic up here if you're on YouTube, but you don't even need to see this to understand and guess who these teams are that we thought were big winners this offseason. You've got the Philadelphia Eagles with Sam Bradford, DeMarco Murray, Ryan Matthews coming in. Chip Kelly is really putting the pieces where he wants them to be, and this offense is going to just explode this season. You've got the Indianapolis Colts, same type of thing. They're bringing in skill position players like Andre Johnson, Frank Gore, and also Trent Cole, and they're really adding a lot of players there offensively who are going to help them in some of these skill positions to try to overcome the deficiencies they've had late in the season and in the playoffs and try to make it to the next level. You've got the Seattle Seahawks who brought on Kerry Williams and Will Blackman, but mainly brought on Jimmy Graham, big tight end, biggest offseason acquisition they've had. That was a trade with the New Orleans Saints. They sent their starting center down to New Orleans in exchange for Jimmy Graham, and that's going to really make this team an instant contender to try to help Russell Wilson in some of the offensive deficiencies that the team has had in terms of catching the ball and receiving, him being such a great weapon. Every single thing I just said likely is true. These players may help their teams eventually, but some of them aren't. And some of them aren't helping right now. And some of the pieces that they gave up to acquire these players is hurting those teams. And actually the Eagles, the Colts, and the Seahawks, three of the teams who everybody thought was big winners back in March and April, are 0-2, every single one of them. They don't have a single win right now. And that's not to say they're not going to win any games this season. Of course not. These are three of the better teams in the NFL. But every single one of those teams won 10-plus games last year. Every single one of those teams thought, we were good last year, but we don't have all the pieces we need. So we're going to go out, not just draft some players, but we're going to go out in free agency and try to figure out how to make our team better in free agency. And now they went from 10 win or more teams to being 0-2 on the season. And for a team like the Seattle Seahawks, who just lost to the Green Bay Packers, they're sitting 3 games behind, basically, for the NFC home field advantage throughout the playoffs. It's going to be very difficult for Seattle to host the NFC Championship game as long as Green Bay and Aaron Rodgers stay healthy and play out the rest of the season. You got another team like the Miami Dolphins who brought in Ndamukong Suh. He was supposed to be a big deal. That defense already was decent in 2014. He was going to bring them over the top. And what has happened? They're saying he's not playing according to the scheme. He's doing his own freelancing. He's got the big money. And now that team is starting off much worse defensively than they even were last year. Now, another team that supposedly didn't do enough in free agency was the New England Patriots, considering they lost Vince Wilfork, they lost Shane Vereen, they lost Brandon Browner, and yet that team is 2-0 and playing just as well as anybody because they know how to draft. The New York Jets is one of the few teams that you can say won in free agency, bringing on Darrelle Revis, Buster Screen, Antonio Cromartie, and Ryan Fitzpatrick, all these players they acquired and is really helping that team. But for the most part, a lot of these teams that you thought were going to win did not. And I'll transition over to mention really quickly, I highly encourage you to go to my website, sharpfootballanalysis.com, and search on the blog, The Art of Drafting. Or just go onto Google and type The Art of Drafting, Sharp Football Analysis. You'll find the articles. I wrote a lot of articles where I broke down tons of analytics and metrics about free agency, about drafting players, about off-season moves. Some of these were posted on Fox Sports. But at any rate, a great article there breaking down how the best teams in the NFL focus on the draft. They don't focus on free agency. And you've got teams like the Pittsburgh Steelers, the Green Bay Packers, the Dallas Cowboys, the Cincinnati Bengals, the New England Patriots. These are teams who rarely go out there and acquire massive, expensive pieces. Most of the time, in the last several years, those teams are working to build their team through the draft. And look at them right now. Green Bay, New England, Cincinnati, all those teams are 2-0. Pittsburgh is 1-1. They lost to New England. And the Dallas Cowboys, even with their losses and injuries, they're sitting at 2-0. So these are teams that care about the draft. They hold on to their draft picks. They don't trade them away for the most part unless they have a ton of draft pieces because other teams stupidly give them extra ones. They just are very smart about drafting. And so we're really seeing an interesting dichotomy of the teams who are building through the draft, having a lot of success, whereas a lot of these teams who are trying to upgrade quickly through free agency are not. Story number 2, explosive plays win games. The graphic I've splashed up here on YouTube, if you're watching online, dictates the different quarterbacks who, on passes that were thrown 15 or more yards down the field, so not screen passes, but big passes thrown down the field, those players from Week 1 games and those players from Week 2's games who averaged at least 15 yards per attempt on those passes. So, for example, on this list is not a quarterback who may have attempted 4 passes down the field of 15 or more yards but didn't complete a single one of them. This is quarterbacks who averaged at least 15 yards or more on passes that went at least 15 yards down the field. And as you can see, basically every single one of these quarterbacks, and there's about 12 of them here, won their games. The only one who lost was Ben Roethlisberger Week 1 against the New England Patriots, and that was a game that was actually much closer than the scoreboard indicated. Several stupid play calls by the Steelers close to the goal line and missed field goals cost that game from being as close as it probably should have been. But at any rate, most of these quarterbacks on here delivered big-time performances in these deep passes, and those really helped break open games. We talked last week on the early podcast that came out earlier in the week about ways that teams are winning games, whether it's through turnovers or whether it's through pressure on the quarterback. And another way is through explosive pass plays. You don't just have to be a great quarterback to do this. Obviously, Ben Roethlisberger did it both his first two games, Aaron Rodgers as well. But even quarterbacks just having great performances at times going deep are winning games. And a couple examples from this past weekend, Johnny Manziel, Jameis Winston. These are guys who hit on a number of big pass plays that really helped to open up those games and propelled each of those teams to getting their first win of the season this past week. Now, a couple guys on here, obviously, who did not win. Jay Cutler, he got knocked out of the game, so it's hard to say whether he would or would not have helped the Bears come back and win that game, but they were only down 8 at halftime. And then Colin Kaepernick, he's on here. He did great deep passing against the Steelers. The problem is he went up against Ben Roethlisberger, who was even better in deep passing against the 49ers, so that kind of offsets itself a little bit. But explosive plays, something to take into account when you're looking at these games, because I think we'll notice a trend, especially here as the weather is good, that the teams that are able to connect on these big pass plays stand a much better chance to win these games, because it's vital to flip-flop the field position and take advantage of plays like that. Story number 3, getting a better understanding of teams' situational tendencies in 2015 that may differ from 2014. If you're watching on YouTube, and you'll see I splashed up another graphic here. This is a run-pass ratio graphic with rankings for the various teams that looks at teams' percentages or tendencies to run the football versus pass the football in all scores, no matter what the score is, whether they're ahead or behind, either when they're winning, when they're losing, or in one-score games. So they've got the ball, they're on offense, the game is within one score. What is their tendency? Now, the way that this is sorted is right now I've sorted it by the one-score game tendency to pass the ball being at the top of the list and run the ball being at the bottom of the list based on 2014. So the Chicago Bears and the Atlanta Falcons were the top two teams that in one-score games were just passing the lights out of the football in 2014. And the teams at the bottom of the list, the Houston Texans and the New York Jets, were teams that in 2014 in one-score games just ran it as much as humanly possible. They were hardly passing it at all. And what we can see is the impact of new personnel, new coaches that have really defined and redefined where these teams sit in these standings. For example, the Chicago Bears now have gone very heavy towards rushing the football. In one-score games, they actually run the football 54% of the time. That's 6th most. They were the number 1 most pass-heavy team in one-score games last season. Now they're the 6th most run-heavy team in 2015 rather, behind Adam Gase and this new offense. A team like the Indianapolis Colts just has no balance whatsoever. We talked about them bringing on Frank Gore in one-score games. Now, this doesn't take into account what they did yet in terms of the game against the Jets, because I don't have that game loaded up yet. It just ended. But 86% pass, I'm guessing that's going to come down a little bit, but still, they're going to be extremely pass-heavy, is my guess, in one-score games in these numbers here for 2015. Again, another team on the reverse who went very run-heavy, the Tampa Bay Buccaneers. They're really trying to give Jameis Winston a leg up by running the football as much as they can. And the Washington Redskins, no surprise that they would try to do that as well, but obviously it's a lot heavier in terms of running the football than they were last season. So, and then we look at a team like the Philadelphia Eagles. The Philadelphia Eagles had been about average in terms of their run-pass ratio in one-score games, but right now they are passing the ball 6th most often in one-score games. 69% of their play calls in one-score games have been pass plays. Only 31% have been run plays. So that's something interesting to take forward with you whether you're handicapping these games, whether you're playing daily fantasy, about how these teams have changed and what some of their tendencies may be moving forward, so you can get a better understanding of what the coach and team is trying to do this year that may be different than last year, and how they're going to match up with the opposing defense. The other key takeaway from this is you can look at the column that says when winning, and you'll notice that the New Orleans Saints, the Indianapolis Colts, and the Philadelphia Eagles, three teams with what you would think is very good offense, has not called a single offensive play with a lead in the game. They have, so far this season, those teams have not had a lead whatsoever in a game. And then if you look at the teams that have never trailed at all in a game so far this year, you've got the Arizona Cardinals and the Cincinnati Bengals. These teams, they may obviously start off the game 0-0, but they have never played with a deficit on any play call that they've had this entire season. So very interesting on the teams that are really struggling or really having a lot of success so far this season. With that said, let's jump right into the guts of this podcast. Let's start breaking down some of these games. All right, let's jump right back into the Thursday nighter. We had the Broncos at the Chiefs. Impressively, the Chiefs recorded 20 first downs, went to third down only 7 times against this Broncos defense. That was the best early on success rate in the NFL last week. However, when they did go to third down, they went 0 of 7. And when they made their 4 trips into the red zone, they went 1 of 4. So they spoiled all of that early down success by not being efficient when things mattered. However, this game obviously decided entirely by turnovers. The Chiefs had 5, the Broncos had only 1. The last 15 years when a team was +4 in turnover margin, as Denver was, and had at least 5 turnovers that they got from the other team in total, which Denver did, those teams went 188-1. That's 99.5% as long as they weren't huge 9 or more point underdogs. Therefore, the fact that Denver almost lost this game despite falling into this 99.5% in-game angle of teams with turnovers was pretty shocking. And that really speaks to how good the Chiefs actually played elsewhere. Despite those indicators in terms of their efficiencies and despite all those turnovers, they ran for 5 yards per carry on the Broncos defense. They held the Broncos to only 2.8 yards per carry, and they really held Peyton Manning down in check. He had an 85 passer rating. Not a very good day. Overall, 4.3 yards per play for the Broncos. So the Chiefs defense played well. The offense was just sloppy with turnovers and not converting when it really mattered, and they almost overcame this ridiculous level of turnovers in that game. Next game up is the Panthers versus the Texans. And this is a game where I really thought both of the teams played like mirror images of one another, except for one key area. And we'll get to that in a second. But both of these quarterbacks, if you look at their stat lines, almost identically terrible. Both of them were sub 50% completions. Both of them were sub 5.0 yards per attempt. Both of them posted sub 70 passer ratings. So all of it was miserable. Both of them threw 1 interception. And both of these teams offensively converted below 32% in third down. So just bad offense, particularly from the passing game, but the difference was the running game. The Panthers were able to run for 172 total yards at 5.2 yards a clip. That was the 4th best rating of any team this week. And they did that on the Texans defense, who had previously held Jamal Charles and the Chiefs down to 3 yards per carry. So I certainly was surprised by how good the Panthers' run game looked. And I also was quite surprised at how bad the Texans' run game looked. They only ran for 2.7 yards per carry and 61 total yards. So as a result of those rushing deficiencies, they had to throw the ball more often. So you look at Ryan Mallett, he had to attempt 58 passes, whereas Cam Newton, even though he was passing pretty poorly, only had to attempt 37 because they could run the ball better. So they let their run game carry the load a little bit more. Then they had to rely on their quarterback. So therefore, more of this game fell onto Ryan Mallett's shoulders. Obviously, the Texans were up early in this game. They led by 3 at the end of 1, and they trailed by 7 basically throughout at the end of the half, at the end of the third quarter, and at the end of the fourth quarter. Even though they came back and tied things up there in the fourth quarter, it was a good performance by the Carolina Panthers. I was on the Texans in this game, took the points, and that was obviously a game where, due to that running situation I didn't expect, the Panthers were able to pull this one out. And certainly we need to look at the Texans moving forward. They were terrible on early down success rate, so that speaks to the Panthers defense as well as the inefficiencies from the Houston Texans. They really need to get Arian Foster back there and make Ryan Mallett more comfortable on those pass plays. He just looks very rattled, especially when pressure gets at him. His ratings under pressure are miserable, one of the worst in the NFL last week. The 49ers at the Steelers. This was a game that the 49ers were off of that late game on Monday night. Back home, traveled out east to play the Steelers at 1 o'clock, and boy, it looks like they left their defense back at home. That defense that looked so good, coached up by Eric Mangini. Everybody thought they were going to be bad, but he coached them up against the Vikings and Teddy Bridgewater week 1. That defense allowed Big Ben and this Pittsburgh Steelers offense to complete 78% of their passes, 13.7 yards per attempt, 156 passer rating, 8.7 yards per play. That 8.7 was decreased tremendously simply because they only ran for 3.4 yards per carry. A ridiculous 8.7 yards per play, best in the NFL by a large margin last week. They went to the 49ers red zone 5 times, converted every single one of those. So this game was really decided by quarterback brilliance as well as execution and efficiency inside the red zone. The 49ers got to the Steelers red zone 4 times. They only converted one of those trips. The 49ers, Colin Kaepernick was sacked 5 times. The 49ers did not sack Ben Roethlisberger at all this game. It's just a very dominant performance by Ben and this Pittsburgh Steelers passing attack against that 49ers secondary. Speaking of secondaries, the Tampa Bay Buccaneers versus the New Orleans Saints. Tampa Bay's deep passing game really came alive this past weekend. Jameis Winston only completed 14 passes, but those went for 9.2 yards per attempt. That was the 3rd highest number in the NFL. He hit on numerous deep passes against the New Orleans Saints. Actually, his accuracy rating on those deep passes was one of the best in the NFL last week in terms of how efficient he was when he was throwing the ball deep and how accurate he was when he was throwing the ball deep. When Jameis Winston threw the ball deep last week, he did it 6 times, and he completed 4 of them for 112 yards and 1 touchdown. Just tremendous numbers from him after a very bad performance week 1. Drew Brees, on the other hand, only 5.8 yards per attempt. That was 25th in the league. The New Orleans Saints only ran the ball for 3.9 yards per carry, so 4.7 yards per play. They got into the Saints red zone 3 times, converted every single one of those into touchdowns. The problem is the Bucs, with their big play ability, got into the Saints red zone 5 times, and even though they only converted 2 into touchdowns, they went 4 for 5 in field goals, and that made the difference. Along with the New Orleans Saints lost the turnover battle by 1. It allowed the Tampa Bay Buccaneers to earn a much-needed victory, winning by 7 points, 26-19. The Minnesota Vikings hosted the Detroit Lions. Detroit was off of a loss out in San Diego the prior week in heartbreaking fashion and came back to face Minnesota in Minnesota. And the Vikings were off of that bad loss in San Francisco late on Monday, came back home, and I loved exactly what Norv Turner and this Vikings team did offensively for Teddy Bridgewater. This is a quarterback who was rattled, perhaps confidence shaken slightly in that week 1 performance against the 49ers. They did not make him do too much. Only 18 pass attempts, but he completed 14 of them, 78% completions, 8.4 yards per pass attempt, and a 120 passer rating for Teddy Bridgewater. So extremely efficient, not asked to do too much, because they were able to run the ball all over this Detroit Lions vaunted run defense from last season, one of the best in the NFL in terms of yards per carry. The Minnesota Vikings ran for 4.7 yards per attempt and 199 total rushing yards. To put it into perspective, the fact that they ran it 42 times and averaged still 4.7 yards per attempt made them the first team this year and just the 37th game where a team since 2011 was able to run for 42 times and yet still average at least 4.7 yards per attempt. So very strong rushing numbers against this Lions defense. Meanwhile, on the flip side, Mike Zimmer coached up this defense tremendously. They shut down the run game entirely for the Lions. Amir Abdullah did nothing. The entire team for the Lions ran 16 times for only 2.4 yards per attempt, only 38 total rushing yards. I'm sure dashed a lot of the dreams of guys who were playing Amir Abdullah after that huge week 1 performance. But Norv Turner and Mike Zimmer coordinated the hell out of this game, really brought their A game in terms of coaching and just dominated the Detroit Lions in this one. The Vikings made 6 trips into the red zone. The Lions only made 3. The Vikings only converted 50%, but it still was enough to win by 10 points over the Detroit Lions. The Chicago Bears versus the Arizona Cardinals. This was another game where I thought offensive coordinator came to play and came with a great game plan, and that was none other than Bruce Arians, who I was recommending. This was going to be a big game. I thought the Cardinals offense would jump all over the Bears. I played the Cardinals team total over as a client recommendation, and this was a pretty easy one, even though they did have 2 non-offensive touchdowns in the form of returns. One on the opening kickoff, another one was an interception return that Jay Cutler ultimately left the game with a hamstring injury. They still scored 48 points in this game, easily eclipsing what their team total was even without those scores. They got down into the Bears' red zone 4 times, converted all 4 of those into touchdowns. Carson Palmer's numbers would have been much better had a lot of the deep passes that he attempted actually were interfered with, and those drew pass interference flags and moved the ball tremendous number of yardage down the field. So those took away from some of his big completions, but nevertheless, he still delivered 115 passer rating with 4 passing touchdowns, 71% completions, but his yards per pass attempt, it would have been much higher than 7.7 had those penalties not been called and his receivers been not interfered with and just caught the pass. Regardless of that, a great game from them. From the Chicago Bears, it's hard to really take away too much. Obviously, you're dealing with Jay Cutler getting injured. They didn't look terrible prior to Jay Cutler going out. In terms of rushing the football, they ran for 3.9 yards per carry. Was not expecting them to be able to do too much against this Arizona Cardinals run defense, which is very good. But when you bring in a backup quarterback, things should snowball out of control a bit against the defense like the Arizona Cardinals. And obviously that is what ended up happening. They were only down by 8 points at halftime, ended up losing by 25 in the second half. So that was a great game by Carson Palmer, great coordination and play calling by Bruce Arians in that one. The Bills and the Patriots, this was one of the marquee early games of the day, and it didn't disappoint. Even though the Patriots at one point broke out to a 24-point lead, it still was a pretty interesting game throughout, as at halftime they were only up by 11, and then the Buffalo Bills came back late in the game to try to make things interesting. But this was just a dominant performance by Tom Brady. He threw 59 pass attempts. This was a very Belichickian performance. When they talk about the run-pass ratios, they only ran it 15 times for 3.7 yards per attempt. Basically, the Patriots said, we're just going to run as minimally as possible to keep the ball in Tom Brady's hands and prevent him from getting sacked too often. We're just going to let him win this game for us. And sure enough, 450 passing yards later, they won this game in pretty dominant fashion with a close finish. They ended up getting 6.7 yards per play. They only punted 1 time against Rex Ryan's defense. When you look at Rex Ryan's offense, though, and what the Bills were able to do with Tyrod Taylor, not terrible when you're talking about his efficiency, which was 77% pass completions. That was 5th best in the NFL. And they were also able to run for 5.9 yards per carry. That was number 1 in the NFL last week. And they got down to the Patriots' red zone 3 times and converted all 3 of those into touchdowns. And obviously they put up 32 points. So when you have an offensive performance like that, it's not the end of the world. The issues were the turnovers. Tyrod Taylor threw 3 interceptions, some of them very poorly timed, and that offensive line was not protecting him well enough at all. The Patriots sacked him 8 times. So this is just a lack of performance from that Bills defense in terms of forcing Tom Brady and the New England Patriots to punt the football. They only went to 3rd down 10 times, and they gained 27 first downs. So very strong early down success rate performance from the Patriots offense. Once again, Bill Belichick just foiled Rex Ryan in this one. When you look at the Cincinnati Bengals and the San Diego Chargers, it was a very competitive game all the way throughout. The biggest lead was for the Bengals early in the game. They ended up going up by 11 points, held on to win by 5, covering a 3.5 point spread. didn't have anything on this game, but it was a good game to watch. Phillip Rivers, very efficient performance once again. Did the same type of thing that he did the prior week. Mike McCoy was having him throw a lot of strong, high-efficiency passes, 21 to 27, that's 78%, 8.3 yards per attempt, and a 110 passer rating. He did throw one interception. And then the Chargers, behind their rookie running back Melvin Gordon, ran for 5.2 yards per carry, which was better than what the Bengals did. They had a better yards per play than the Bengals did. The difference became some of the bigger plays that Cincinnati was able to hit, as well as obviously the red zone efficiency. The Bengals got down into the red zone 4 times and converted 2 into touchdowns. The Chargers only got down into the Bengals red zone twice and converted only 1 of those into touchdowns. The Cleveland Browns and the Tennessee Titans was a game where I said pump the brakes a little bit on Marcus Mariota. Last week on this podcast, I mentioned that once teams figure out what Ken Whisenhunt was trying to do with him offensively, that got him so much success against the Tampa Bay Buccaneers in their Week 1 game, they're going to be able to figure out a way to slow him down. And sure enough, in this particular game, they were able to do that in large part due to pressure. They sacked him 7 times, and they forced him to be relatively inefficient as a passer. Only 57% completions, only 5.9 yards per attempt. Obviously, those numbers tremendously different from what he had produced the prior week. Now, one of the keys, obviously, was did they have a run game to support him? And actually, in this game, they did. They ran for 5.5 yards per carry. This is one of the Achilles heels of the Cleveland Browns. They allowed a ton of yardage to the New York Jets last week on the ground. Once again, allowed a ton of yardage to the Tennessee Titans on the ground. They brought in they drafted Danny Shelton, a tackle in the draft to try to help shore up that run defense, but clearly it still has a ways to go. So the Titans, who couldn't really run the ball very well at all, previously were able to get 5.5 yards per carry, 166 total yards. That was the second best yards per rush average, so something to consider moving forward. In addition, with the Cleveland Browns to consider moving forward, this offense, don't let this one game fool you in terms of their productivity. They only had 13 first downs in this entire game, which was 29th in the NFL. Johnny Manziel only completed 8 passes in this entire game. He only attempted 15 attempts. These were big pass plays, obviously, as you saw on the highlights. Went for a ton of yardage. His 10.5 yards per attempt was second best in the NFL, only to Big Ben. His passer rating of 130 was second best, only to Big Ben as well. So very low volume, but extremely big plays. They could not run the football at all, 3.9 yards per attempt. So certainly something to consider if you're thinking they had this massive win over Marcus Mariota. And now they're going to host the Oakland Raiders this weekend. Definitely the Cleveland Browns, that victory offensively was a little hollow, and against the ground game of the Tennessee Titans gave up a ton. So something to move forward and consider. With the Atlanta Falcons and the New York Giants, what can you say about Tom Coughlin, Eli Manning, and the Giants at the end of the games? They're the worst in the NFL. It's not just me saying that. It's not hyperbole. It's an actual fact. Since 2012, I believe they're now 1-7 in games that are decided by 3 or fewer points. This game obviously was decided by 4 points, but they have a terrible record in games decided by less than 7 points as well. So just a very bad performance from the New York Giants and Eli Manning at the end of this game. Now, this was a game they were up by 10 points at the end of the third quarter. They snuffed out the Atlanta Falcons' run game, held them to 2.5 yards per carry, held Matt Ryan pretty much in check. He had an average day compared to what he did previously against the Philadelphia Eagles, only 7.5 yards per pass attempt, only a 95 passer rating. They only let the Falcons into the red zone 3 times, but they did convert every single time they were down there. This is a game I took the Giants team total under in the first half and under for the game. I just figured the pace of this game was going to be slower, as well as some other things I share with my clients, and obviously that came to fruition. Both of those won. The New York Giants 1-4 in the red zone. Third down attempts, they went to third down 17 times, only converted 19 first downs. So not a tremendously efficient performance from the Giants offensively, but this was a game where obviously the Giants did have one more turnover than the Falcons did, and the Falcons were able to pull off this strong come-from-behind victory with a little bit of good luck in their favor as the Giants continued to screw things up late in games. The Redskins at the Rams, this is a great game that really demonstrates how in week 1 of the NFL, you kind of have to take everything you saw with a little bit of grain of salt, particularly when it comes to betting these games, and try to flip some things around in week 2, because the Redskins really came out in this game, played very well, and the Rams simply did not bring it on the road against the Redskins. When you look at this game, this goes to what I was saying this past offseason about their GM, Scott McLaughlin, what he did coming from San Francisco, going to Seattle, then coming to Washington. He added a lot of pieces this offseason to this defense that really aren't household names necessarily, but who scored really well. They didn't pay him the big bucks, but these are guys that perform extremely well. They're not your Ndamukong Suh, who's taken up a huge percentage of your salary cap and maybe then doesn't perform well. These are guys who got great grades last season from some of the Pro Football Focus sites out there and produced very well defensively. They had a good performance defensively week 1 against the Miami Dolphins. This past week, same exact thing. But I was most impressed by the way that this offense performed and executed against a very good St. Louis Rams front and a very good overall St. Louis Rams defense. If you look at what Jay Gruden did, you have to give him credit at least for this. With Kirk Cousins, 27 attempts, completed 85% of those attempts. That was the best in the NFL, and we're not talking he went 9 of 12 or something like that. He completed 23 of 27 passes, 85% completions against this defense. The other thing that the Redskins were able to do was run on this defense. 37 rush attempts, 182 yards, 4.9 yards per attempt. So when you have an offense that is as efficient as their offense was against this Rams defense, you're going to control the time of possession, particularly when the Redskins held the Rams to only 2 of 12 on third downs, 17%. That was one of the worst numbers in the NFL, 28th in the NFL this past week. Allowed no trips to the Rams into the red zone. So the Redskins held the ball for almost 38 minutes in this game. The Rams just about 22 minutes. Just a dominant performance from the Rams offense. The Redskins, it's not that they were recording a ton of sacks. They only got 1 sack in this game, but they pressured Nick Foles enough to make his accuracy down to 53%. He only passed for 4.6 yards per attempt. Both those numbers were pretty terrible. And though the Rams were able to run for 5.2 yards per attempt on the ground, they only ran 13 times simply because of the way the Redskins controlled the clock and built a 17-point lead. The Rams had no other option but to let Nick Foles try to throw it, and that obviously did not go over well. Speaking of things that did not go over well, the Dolphins and the Jaguars game, Miami always is getting off to these slow starts. I've documented it on my Twitter or on my website, sharpfootballanalysis.com, or if you're following me on Twitter at sharpfootball. I've gone on several times about how the head coach Philbin gets off to slow starts, and I know that he likes to defer the ball, but at the same time, when he does get the ball, their very first drive, only 2 teams in the NFL score touchdowns less frequently under the last 4 years that Joe Philbin has been there than the Miami Dolphins. They just do not come out of the gates very strong. Their game scripting, their play calling at the beginning of games is very bad and generally gets them in a hole, and that's exactly what happened. The Jaguars built a 10-3 lead and never looked back in this game. The Miami Dolphins never had the lead at all. Jaguars ultimately opened up to 11-point lead after winning by 3 at the end there. Look, the Jaguars did not have an extremely strong day in terms of efficient passing or running. They only ran for 3.7 yards per attempt. They only passed for 55% completions from Blake Bortles, but they did just enough in this game to get there. When he was throwing the ball, there were several deep passes. He hit for 8.3 yards per attempt. And overall, this team ran for a total combined yards per play of 6 yards per play. That was actually 8th best in the league last week. The Miami Dolphins, not a terrible game out of Ryan Tannehill from the passing game. 2 touchdowns, no interceptions, 68% completions. He had to throw the ball 44 times, though, because they could not do anything on the ground. Only 2.6 yards per carry. The running offense has been a problem for the Miami Dolphins these first couple weeks of the season. And as such, they only ran 16 times, so therefore they're passing 44, only running 16. Is not a very good ratio to be in, particularly in a close game. It's not as if, at one point the game was an 11-point lead for the Jaguars, but at the end of the first quarter and at halftime, the Dolphins only trailed by 7 points. The game was tied at the end of the third quarter. Absolutely no reason other than just complete lack of confidence in the run game for them to only run 16 times and pass 44. They got down into the red zone twice, did the Dolphins, converted both of those trips, but just not very efficient overall from the Miami Dolphins in this game. A big win for the Jacksonville Jaguars. The Baltimore Ravens at the Oakland Raiders. The Ravens stayed out west after their game last week versus the Denver Broncos, and you think they had a good defensive performance against Peyton Manning and the Denver Broncos. Their offense needs to come along. We just saw Andy Dalton light up the Raiders the prior week, so this should be a good recipe for the Ravens in terms of finding their way offensively in this game. When you saw what Joe Flacco did, he was not too bad in terms of his efficiency. 71% completions, 8.5 yards per attempt. That was fourth best in the league. 102 passer rating, which is about average last week because there was just a lot of good quarterback play. But he did throw one interception. He did throw 2 passing touchdowns. The story here primarily was the Ravens defense. They just did not do anything against this Oakland Raiders offense. When you look at the Oakland Raiders offensively, they ran for 5.1 yards per attempt. They passed for 7.6 yards per attempt. So 6.8 yards per play, third best in the NFL. And when they went to third down, that was the big difference in this game. The Oakland Raiders, 64% completions on third down. The Baltimore Ravens, only 36% completions. So even though time of possession overall was basically split down the middle in this game, the Raiders were far more efficient at moving the ball on third downs when they got into third down. Interestingly enough, however, this was a game that should make the Baltimore Ravens sick. They got into the Oakland Raiders red zone 6 times. 6. They only converted twice. The Raiders only got into the Ravens red zone 3 times the entire game. So double the amount of trips into the red zone, but walking away with the exact same number of touchdowns as the Oakland Raiders had. So it's just a game that obviously John Harbaugh was sick about. It was a fun game to watch. A lot of offense, very little defense in this one, though. 37-33 for the Raiders. Speaking of the exact opposite, a game which had a lot of defense and a lot of terrible offense, the Philadelphia Eagles. What can we say about what they are doing in Philadelphia right now against the Dallas Cowboys? The Philadelphia came home. I thought, along with most people out there, thought that the Philadelphia Eagles would find a way to figure things out and at least look better. Maybe we're not talking about they're going to look like the Eagles of 2013 when Chip Kelly first got there, or even 2014, but they're going to look better than they did against the Atlanta Falcons, and boy, they looked way worse. Sam Bradford, he just looks frail in the pocket. He looks skinny. He looks immobile. He just does not look like a very good fit for this offense. And I've said it before. I've gone on record against Sam Bradford historically about how he does not pass the ball well down the field. But I thought in the Chip Kelly offense, that Chip Kelly would be able to fix that, primarily through play action. I felt that the play action frequency that Chip Kelly runs, something Bradford has not experienced in his NFL career, was really going to help him get going. But as we all know, in order to run play action, you have to have some threat of a run. You have to have some time in the pocket, and Bradford doesn't really have either. This run game is not getting off the ground because the offensive line is not getting their blocking assignments down. Chip Kelly let both their guards go this past offseason, tried to focus instead on bringing in running backs, and that has not worked whatsoever. This team cannot run the football at all right now against anybody, and that's not going to help anything for the quarterback whatsoever. Who knows even if they get a run game what that will do for the quarterback, but we certainly know that it's going to help. The key is, though, they've got to be able to stretch the field a little bit, and they're not stretching the field at all right now, are the Philadelphia Eagles. Sam Bradford just looks like he's locking on to the easiest receiver in the pattern and trying to throw the ball to that guy, which at times results in interceptions like he had, threw one into the end zone against the Dallas Cowboys this past weekend. Dallas, this is a team that's going to be causing some problems for themselves moving forward as well. Obviously, we know the injuries now are piling up. You've got Tony Romo out. You've got Des Bryant out. You've got their backup running backs who are now their starters this year. They only ran for 3.3 yards per attempt. Let's think about that game though for a second when you're talking about the Philadelphia Eagles game with the Cowboys. As bad as the Eagles looked, they only gained 2 first downs the entire game. That offense was doing absolutely nothing. I think they went 3 and out at least 5 consecutive times to start that game. Dallas didn't even have an offensive touchdown until the bitter end of that game. Dallas didn't even make it to the Eagles' red zone despite having 41 minutes time of possession in that game. Dallas made it to the Eagles' red zone only twice, converted neither time into touchdowns. So Dallas's offense, not good either, and now it's going to be even worse without Tony Romo in there. So they're this team that's really just going to try to milk the clock and hope for the best. Call as few plays as possible and leave their defense out on the field as little as possible. But I don't know how that's going to work without the brilliance of Tony Romo in there to bail them out on some of those plays where he's able to make something out of nothing with the limited talent that they have at wide receiver. But I don't know that you could really take away a ton of this game because both offenses did look so terrible. Both defenses played well. You got to give them that. The defenses are what stepped it up and made it more difficult on the offenses. But Chip Kelly got to go back to the drawing board, and I'm not so much on board with what's going on with Sam Bradford right now as I was after the preseason. Obviously, he just looks like he's shell-shocked back there, so hopefully they can figure something out to get him going a little bit better. Moving on to the Sunday night game, Packers and Seahawks. This was a great game. It was a game that was full of excitement, and I love the coaching tactics that started to come to fruition in this game, particularly in the second half. You saw the Seattle Seahawks trail heading into the locker room by 10 points. Russell Wilson only had 2 designed runs in the first half, or he carried the ball 2 times in the first half. They come out the first few drives in that second half. Russell Wilson is running read option left and right. It prevented the Green Bay Packers from making halftime adjustments to try to prevent those. It was a great game. It really opened things back up in the second half. The Seahawks built a 4-point lead. And but for a Russell Wilson interception, that would have been a much more interesting finish and conclusion to that game that the Packers ultimately won by 10 points. When you look at some of the metrics in game, Aaron Rodgers, once again, brilliant performance, 76% completions, 115 passer rating, but neither team particularly strong on third downs. The Green Bay Packers only converted 36% of their third down attempts. The Seattle Seahawks, one thing I've been saying about the Green Bay Packers, and I'll continue to say it, their defense may be not as good as people think. Yeah, they were good when they forced Seattle into third down, but they didn't force Seattle into third down much. Only 9 third down attempts, 21 first downs for the Seattle Seahawks. Seattle was able to rush for 4.8 yards per attempt. A lot of that came on Russell Wilson's runs, though, from the read option, as opposed to Marshawn Lynch. Overall, a good game, but here's the big problem. Now, Green Bay obviously has a huge lead. It's a 3-game lead right now in terms of home field advantage. And the Seahawks are sitting there at 0-2 right now. So, a big win for the Green Bay Packers and a very exciting game. And last game of the week was the game we just saw, and the New York Jets beating the Indianapolis Colts. This is a game just dominated by turnovers in the defensive front of the New York Jets. 5 takeaways, only 1 giveaway. Obviously, that's the story of the game in a nutshell. You're not going to win games in the NFL turning the ball over 5 times like the Indianapolis Colts did. They had Frank Gore fumbled it heading into the end zone one time that the Jets were able to recover. Andrew Luck, not a very good performance whatsoever. 6.8 yards per attempt, 3 interceptions, only 1 touchdown. They just couldn't get anything going, and the Jets maintained time of possession, were able to move the ball down the field. The Colts secondary is all banged up currently, so Eric Decker and Brandon Marshall each had at least 7 catches for almost 100 yards apiece, 1 touchdown apiece. Very efficient there. Running the football, the Colts did a decent job of stopping the run for the most part. Chris Ivory only carried it 14 times for 57 yards. As a team, the New York Jets only rushed for 3.7 yards per attempt. But that really wasn't the difference. They were able to just slowly run the football a little bit and make things happen in the pass game when they needed to, and otherwise they just used their defense and the turnovers to their advantage and won a pretty easy game from start to finish. Breaking down some of these injuries, there were a lot of players injured this past week. let's jump right into it. For the Buffalo Bills, Aaron Williams, we're not sure what his status is, but he injured his neck. He was actually carted off. We'll have to see when he might be able to return. Luke Kuechly, he's under the concussion protocol. He missed last week's game. He probably should be able to return to this game, but we'll have to see depending on him practicing. Jericho Cotchery injured his ankle in the game, wide receiver for the Panthers as well. For the Chicago Bears, Jay Cutler, he messed up his hamstring, so he is listed as questionable moving forward week to week right now, early in the week. How many weeks is he going to be out? We'll have to see. Alshon Jeffrey, he missed last week's game because he injured his hamstring as a result of a calf injury that he had, so we'll have to see if he's going to be able to come back with the backup quarterback of Jimmy Clausen this week. Tony Romo broke his clavicle. He is scheduled for a Week 12 return. That's one of the biggest injuries that we're going to see of any this week, so that was a big deal for the Dallas Cowboys. Jason Witten, he tweaked his ankle. I think he's going to be okay, though. Ronald Leary, the guard for the Cowboys, he's week to week with a groin injury. Matthew Stafford, the Lions quarterback, he injured his arm, ribs area. He's likely to play, but he was a little bit banged up after that game. The Packers suffered a number of losses. They lost Josh Boyd, their defensive lineman, to the season. He's going to be done. Devontae Adams, he tweaked his ankle, as did Eddie Lacy. It seems like both those guys may try to give it a go, though, this upcoming week. There was some talk that they could be out for a little bit of time, but I think that they should be able to go this upcoming week. The Houston Texans lost tackle Jeff Adams. He's on IR. He's done for the season with a knee injury. The Colts, Vontae Davis, he went out for that game with a concussion. We'll have to see if he's ready to play next week. The Jaguars, Denard Robinson, he's out indefinitely with a knee injury that he sustained. The Miami Dolphins, Lamar Miller, he hurt his ankle. Brandon Albert, hamstring. Jordan Cameron, a groin. We'll have to see. I don't think any of those may be too serious, but those are waiting some more injury information. Drew Brees, he's out indefinitely with a shoulder injury, potentially. They say he just bruised the rotator cuff. I'm not sure exactly how that works, but at any rate, I don't think he tore it, but whether or not he'll play, we'll have to see. Obviously, he's a big deal, and the Saints aren't doing anything this year anyways with that defense, so why put him out there if he could injure it worse, is my point of view. Eric Flowers and Dominique Rodgers-Cromartie both injured themselves for the Giants. Kiko Alonso and Michael Hendricks for the Eagles, 2 losses. Both those guys left the game last week. Kiko Alonso is out indefinitely with a knee injury, and Michael Hendricks with a hamstring injury. We'll have to see when either of those guys could return, but it sounds like Kiko is the bigger deal there, and he's a big impact player for them. Was coming back off of an injury, hopefully be healthy this year. Carlos Hyde for the 49ers, he's day-to-day with a thigh injury. And that's pretty much the extent of some of the most severe injuries. So we'll have to see as the week progresses. We'll touch back on this on our podcast later in the week. All right, guys, have a great week.
This is going to be a fun ride. This is going to be a fun ride. Everybody one clap. I'm going to play when I want to play. Do what I want to do. I'm going to say what I want to say. Did I say anything stupid today? My role is to take the ball deep, take the top off the defense. Take the ball deep, take the top off the defense. If I can't get to it, nobody can get to it. I don't shine shoes, I don't tape ankles, I don't cut checks. Great cash, homie. I don't shine shoes, I don't tape ankles, I don't cut checks. Great cash, homie. Everybody one clap, one clap, one clap, one clap.